So this is for lines 75 through 83 of the RDB case study.
Study the first time.
So I'm going to start with the definition, maybe.
You have to click the.
Tricky.
You have to click the thing.
There.
Yeah.
There we
Okay.
go. Hell yeah.
So demand is the desire and ability of consumers to pay for a product or service, in this case for RDB, ball bearings. Alright, industrialization is the process of adding the means to produce goods in a specific location. So in this case, Brazil, India, and China, I believe it was that. Just everything. No? Alright, so location is the positioning of a business, and this includes the headquarters, factories, and other business-related buildings. So RDB is in the process of adding more locations if Anna's plan were to be accepted in Brazil, India, and China. Alright, is everyone finished? Nope.
Thought I made it kind of clear, but.
That was passive aggressive.
Okay, are you done now?
No. I'm done.
Okay.
Hold on. Go ahead.
Alright. So logistics is the management of the flow of goods from one location to another. Anna wants to improve logistics by adding locations close to consumers.
I feel like we're thinking else even. Huh?
Yes.
We are logistics. I love it. What commercial? I'm annoying?
Alright. So distribution is making a product or service available to consumers.
Do you hear them when they talk to me?
Alright. And then the working capital cycle is the time between the first cash expenses on a product and the first customer payment for the product. So it's basically continues throughout the development of the product. And then all the working capital from the beginning that you get from the product can be cycled back into the development of a new product.
Excellent.
Alright. Just tell me when you're finished this time.
Okay. Sounds good. That's just.
Done?
Almost done.
Okay.
I want you to. Okay, I'm good.
Okay.
Know what he wants. I'm good, you go ahead.
So basically, this passage is about how Anna Holstein realizes that demand in Brazil, China, and India is soon going to overshadow demand in the other Norwegian countries, and that RDB would gain a competitive advantage if they were to move to these locations first, the first mover advantage. And then she also considers rejecting RDB's outdated strategy of large mega factories in exchange for more flexible ones. And flexible is an interesting word to choose because it could mean multiple things. It could mean that they could use just-in-time production, although I'm not entirely sure how well this would work for ball bearings, considering for the most part, you'd imagine that a whole ton would have to be produced at once, and that flow production would probably be best for this. But also it could mean that they could rent out the factories for other purposes. She's going to create more factories, not just mega factories, but more factories in those locations, which means that if one place had less demand at that point in time, they could rent it out to another business, and they could produce on that for a while, and they could gain some extra capital that way. All right. So I guess I did have a slide on that. So flexible factories.
Good.
Alright, so these are my questions. First, evaluate the potential impacts of creating smaller, more flexible factories on RDB's production. So the first point to consider this would be the material transport. This could increase or decrease based on the factory's proximity to raw materials. If they were to create smaller, more flexible factories, they'd have more locations which could be placed closer to the factories, but then again, they'd also have to create more transport to and from these factories, which could influence where they want to put them. And then these new suppliers would also have to be found, which could prove to be costly. RDB doesn't have a relationship with any of these suppliers at this point, because they'd be in completely new countries, so they'd have to navigate around that, and they might have a shorter payback period until these are fully established. They also said that the scale of economies may be lost. Smaller order shipments from these newer locations would mean that they wouldn't get the scale of economies they get from larger mega factories. And then I also said that labor costs may be smaller due to location. Brazil, China, and India, since they are industrializing, there's a good chance that they'll have these raw materials readily available for them. Alright, and so for the second question, analyze potential factors influencing RDB's decision on where to place factories in Brazil, China, and India. Alright, so the first thing to consider would be site costs, land costs, and construction. This would vary based on the location both in China, India, and Brazil, and also the country that they're actually in. And so it should just be considered. Some places will have higher costs, and you should probably avoid those. But if the land quality and location is better, it may be worth it. Labor costs. Different places in different continents and countries will have varying labor costs. So it depends on the sort of jobs you're trying to get from that location. For the most part, they're going to want both cheap labor from these countries, as well as a bit more experienced labor for some of the higher level jobs. And so they don't want to alienate one group by going to a place that will only have cheap labor. They'll want to consider transport costs again. They'll want to consider basically the distance from the factories to the raw materials, and also the distance of the factories to the final sales location, because this is something that they're actually saying in the case study. This will improve logistics of the company. The sales revenue potential. So they have to choose a good location. Once again, it also has to do with the proximity to the customer. Government grants could be available in other countries, which you may not be able to get otherwhere. It could also be in different parts of the country. So if they were to settle those, they could get some extra capital, which they're going to need to set up these more extra factories. And then also safety. It's not as big of an issue in these because they're fairly well-developed countries, but there could be some locations which are more prone to crime, and so they're going to want to stay out of those areas. So the last question is evaluate possible ethical considerations if RDB were to create factories in Brazil, India, and China. So this first one would be labor and safety. China especially has some good cheap labor, but at the same time, for the public image, it would be good not to exploit the people there. And so it also may make it so they lose repeat customers if they learn that they are exploiting labor. So that would be a bad idea. And then they would also want to consider environmental concerns. Some of these locations will have less focus on environmental concerns and will allow for basically different ways to get through the problems. They could use different chemicals in their productions. And so they're going to want to basically just balance this with the fact that if they are too bad for the environment, it's not going to be good for their image, as well as the fact that Anna is trying to go for a more green image. It means that they're going to want to stay in a location that has a reasonable amount of laws for environmental concerns.
Regulations.
That's it. Took me a while to get that one.
Good.
That's all.
You know, and let's just talk about this last question real quick. I mean, that is Anna's push is that she's, they're being socially responsible, green engineering, and you do want to make sure that you're getting that on all levels. And I think it was Ben's where we talked about decreased energy, how ironic it was that it's a ball bearing. That's the purpose. We need to make that happen in the plants. It's the same thing here. You have to take those things deep when you're looking at social responsibility. Good.
All right.
Questions? Give them a hand.